Hey, I'm Pep, and this is a Pep Talk. Now today, we're going to talk about two-player games. That's four. And I don't just mean 4 or 5-player games where you're simply only playing with 2 people. Although some of the things I talk about will apply to those. But I'm more talking about those games where they're designed. Me versus you. Well, probably not you who's watching, but me versus somebody who maybe lives closer. Well, I guess we could be playing games online. Alright, let's not go down that rabbit hole right now. Instead, let's just jump right in to my advice. See, with bigger games, I'll often talk about being peaceful and not trying to interrupt your opponents and all that kind of stuff. But when it's just 2 people playing, oh no. All bets are off. It's you versus them. There's no being peaceful. There's no not having to worry about ganging up on another player. You're definitely ganging up on that other player because that other player is your only opponent. And this lets you do a few things that normally not necessarily you can't do in larger games, but things that are more difficult to do, such as total point counting. If you're playing a 6-player game and you try to count up everybody's points on the spot, likely you're going to get yelled at for taking so long. But in a 2-player game, it's usually pretty easy. You can look at what they have, figure out, oh, they got about 15 points so far. Look what you have, and you have 16. Neat, you're winning. But let's keep it that way. In a lot of games, you're going to be doing something, taking an action, maybe you're taking cards, maybe you're taking resources, whatever. But generally, whatever you're doing is going to be a back and forth between you and your opponent, and you'll usually be taking from approximately the same pool. So assuming that's true, you can really easily figure out what will gain you a lot of points, but you can also easily figure out what will gain your opponent a lot of points. And this is where some fun math will come in, because let's say you're given the option to choose first between one of 3 things. One option is generally pointless to both you and your opponent. The other option would be worth about 5 points to you, and then the third option would be worth 6 points to your opponent. Well, that sounds easy. You just take the thing that's worth more points for you. Well, no, not quite. You probably want to take the thing that's most points to your opponent, right? Because if it's just you versus me, and I take away 7 of your points, I'm basically gaining 7 points, right? Well, no, not quite. Because in actuality, you have to figure out if you will gain any points from taking their card, and if they would gain any points from taking your card. So in the same situation where one was 6 for you and 7 for them, if the one that is 6 for you could also be 4 for them, but the one that's 7 for them is only worth 1 for you, then it's bad for you to take the one that's for them. Because in that case, they actually gain points while you simply lose points trying to stop them from losing points. And sometimes these things are harder to count because there might be a total that needs to be added up later, or it might be cumulative. So taking it now would stop them from getting 2 points, but if they were to keep trying to take that strategy, it might take 10, 15 points away from them in the end. So sometimes you can't calculate it perfectly, but it's important to look at how much it gains you versus how much it gains them, and the other options on the table, the same thing. And the nice part about a 2-player game is you can usually think a little bit more, and your opponent is a little more lenient with you. In a 5-player game, it gets really annoying when everybody takes 10-15 minutes, because then you sit there for like half an hour not doing anything between turns. But in a 2-player game, if each of you take 10 minutes thinking and planning and doing your own turn, it doesn't really make that big of a difference. It's how you want to play the game. And on top of that, you don't have the extra people's turns in between to think about it. You're pretty much going boom, 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 boom. So there's a very good excuse for having to actually think and strategize on your turn. And so you should. You should think and strategize quite a bit, because really, you're not playing the game to see how many points you can get. You're playing the game, likely, to beat your opponent. And to have fun, of course, by beating your opponent. But you also have to be careful not to beat yourself. Because all these things that I'm telling you about trying to thwart your opponent and knowing that you can potentially stop them from getting more points by taking things that they need, well, that goes the other way too. And likely, your opponent might also take things that you need. So, my advice in this case is, if you're given the opportunity to take multiple strategies, one of which will give you, high consistent points, and another of which would give you a much higher likely score as long as none of your combo pieces are taken along the way, you probably don't want to go for that risky one. Because if all it takes is somebody taking one or two cards or actions or whatever that you want to take, and that's enough to basically ruin your whole game, that is not worth the risk. Not in a two-player game. Because again, you have much more opportunity to stop and think and see, oh yeah, that's exactly what they would need. You don't have to think about everybody at the same time. You can razor focus onto one person. Razor focus? Laser focus? Taser focus. In a two-player game, you're probably close enough to taser somebody, right? Sorry, I'm being very violent. I guess it's the whole competitiveness of a two-player game that's getting me going. Now, what if it's a thinkier style two-player game, like chess or Go or something like that? You're not really taking actions or getting cards or anything like that. You have equal pieces and you're just pitted against your opponent's intellect. Well, in these situations, usually you have 2 or 3 different types of game you're going to end up playing. Either one, you are quite confident that you know the game better than your opponent and can probably strategize better or just are better. If you play something like chess with people, it's quite often easy to figure out who is just on a different tier level above someone else in a game like that, because it's entirely strategy and thinking, and until you've had the practice with a lot of it and memorizing some of the different moves and openings and all that kind of thing, there are tiers and it's pretty easy to figure out where you are. So, again, maybe you think you're above your opponent. Well, that's great. You can probably just do whatever you're doing. If anything, if you actually think that, it might be best to not rub it in. Because likely you're playing the game for fun, or maybe to teach them the game for the first time, or to just get them interested in it. You want a partner that, will be able to challenge you. Well, don't open up with that classic 4-turn win that you can do in chess. If someone hasn't played chess before, they're just going to say something like, what? That seemed really easy. I don't want to play a game that's that easy to win. Or they'll just think you're so many leagues above them that there's no point in them even trying. So I'm not saying to throw the game or to go super easy on them. I'm saying don't do extremely complicated or unnecessary things. Could you castle? Sure. Do you need to castle against someone who doesn't even know what castling is? No. Now the second possibility is the opposite. Whatever game you're playing, you know that your opponent is better than you, or at least you assume. So in this case, well, you're going to be trying to learn the game. Now the easiest way to learn is to imitate. I did say the right word. I thought I was going to say intimidate, but I didn't. You want to imitate them, and you want to see what they're doing and essentially copy it. Now, don't just blindly copy everything that they do. I'm being a little bit more figurative here. If you notice they're going for some sort of a strategy that revolves around wood and uses that in order to build it up and get a lot of points from that, maybe you take a similar strategy. You try to grab something like stone and things that benefit from stone. But the point is, if you see a player who's seasoned and knows the game really well and they're going for a particular strategy, odds are that type of strategy is something that will work. So copying approximately what they're doing and trying to do a similar thing, albeit obviously a little different to make sure that you don't just butt heads and not be able to do the same thing, that can be a good strategy. Same as something like chess. If your opponent does something, don't just immediately respond to it. Look at what they did and try to figure out A, why they did it, and B, what they're going to do later. Did they do it in response to what you did, or did they do it in order to set up a later play? And if it is to set up a later play, what is that play? Is there something that they can reach? And, if you have to go 2 moves ahead, if they move somewhere, can they then immediately move somewhere else and finish you off? Those are the kind of things to look for. And in a game like chess, or maybe you're playing Onitama or Stratego or something, being able to see a few moves ahead is usually what makes you good at those kind of games. And this isn't advice for just those kind of games. This is advice for a lot of two-player games in general. If you can not only see what your opponent is doing this turn, but assume based on that what they'll do on their next turn, or even the turn after that, you have a huge leg up. You don't have to rely turn by turn on taking the things you think they'll need, or trying to thwart each individual thing they do. If you know that they're building this and this because that'll help get them the things that they need for this, once they're at step 2, you can take step 4 away from them. So they essentially wasted step 1 and 2 getting whatever they needed for a thing they don't even have access to. And something like chess can be the same thing. You don't necessarily have to move or change whatever it is that they were about to attack, but you can change the thing that you think they're going to attack after that in order to make the original attack less enticing. It might also just confuse the heck out of your opponent. But it's also possible that you're both on the approximate same skill level. In this case, do whatever you were planning on doing. Yeah, tricked you. You thought I had some good advice. No. Whatever you thought was good, it's probably good. Because it's possible I haven't even played the game you've played before, so you probably know more than I do on this subject. But if you want some general advice anyway, I'm going to give some quick things just in general in games that are good. I'm not going to explain them really deep because I've mentioned them in previous Pep Talks before. 1, actions are good. If you have something that gives you extra actions or even extra partial actions, like an extra free thing you can do each turn, is good. You're doing more than your opponent is, so bang. Number 2 is that things have value. Resources have value, cards have value. If you can get more value out of something than your opponent is getting, it's not necessarily going to win you the game, but it's going to make it an easier process. This is often how somebody who maybe isn't as good at the game as someone else could possibly peel ahead. If you're getting better value out of the things that you're doing, it will lead overall, even with a worse strategy, to possibly a better outcome. Number 3, watch your opponent. But no, not how I meant before, to just see what they're doing and what they're planning. Watch them physically. Watch them emotionally. When people do things, here's the thing. If you're playing something like poker, people try to hide their tells. People try to make fake tells. People try to use bluffing to counteract what you're doing or to supplement what they're doing. Heck, any game that has a bluffing element will often have people doing this. But do you know when people usually don't bluff? When they're playing a worker placement game, because they don't think they need to bluff. They don't think they need to hide their tells. But people have tells. And people have emotional responses to things. And again, they don't think they're playing the kind of game where it matters, so they don't try to hide it, usually. I'm going to give you some examples on that one, though. Let's say you take a particular card. Now, you're not doing it to thwart them, but you take a particular card, and either they're very obvious about it, and they're just like, ugh, okay, well, you took something they wanted. Might be a good idea to figure out why they wanted that. But they might not be quite so subtle as to just immediately groan. They might instead start darting their eyes around, basically to say, oh, I need to figure out a different thing to do on my turn, because that's what I was planning on doing. That one's the more likely one. A lot of people don't actually actively groan when you do whatever they want to do in a 2-player game because they probably feel like that's a little telling, but they do change what their emotions are, what their actions are. They're going to start looking around. They might look a little more nervous. Maybe if they were smiling before, maybe they just started frowning. They started looking a little more unhappy. No, none of these things are perfect. Maybe they're just having a random emotional response. Maybe they're having a bad day and, something just reminded them of something. There's a lot of factors, but if you watch someone consistently during a game, you can often see these kind of things. You can see the positive ways too. Maybe a new card flips out or a new action becomes available and their eyes just light up like, this is so good. Well, maybe it'd be good for you too. Or maybe it'd be a good idea to at least figure out why it's so good for them. It's not even a bad idea to watch how they act whenever you're thinking of things. If you're looking at particular spots, trying to debate exactly what you want. Maybe you're even kind of talking aloud a little bit. You can sometimes see how people are reacting to what you're saying or even where you're looking on the board. Overall, just think about the emotional state and the physical state of your opponent while playing a two-player game. But this definitely leads into number 4. Oh, my fingers bent funny. And this one is, don't be a jerk. Maybe the two of you are being fairly competitive. Maybe you're, throwing some insults back and forth in good fun. But not everyone plays that way, and even if you are doing it in good fun, careful not to go too far. Even though it's one-on-one and you're probably being a little more competitive than you normally would be, at the end of the day, you're playing a game to have fun, likely with a friend. So if every time your friend does something wrong or ends up losing points because of something, you have a big dumb grin on your face like it's the funniest thing you've ever seen in the world, that person might not want to play games with you for much longer. People don't usually like sore losers, but they usually don't like sore winners either. And it's possible to have fun without, rubbing it into your opponent's face. So just be careful and think about your actions when playing these kind of games. Essentially, don't be a jerk. It was a real coincidence that ended up being number 4. And the last one, number 5, is to learn from your mistakes. And to admit to yourself, at the very least, that you made them. Oftentimes, especially in a two-player game, you see people end in basically one of two ways. Either, oh, you won because of this random thing that happened during the game and just gave you extra points. Got a lucky card, got a lucky strategy, whatever. Or B, oh, I just made a really bad mistake early on and that lost me the game. Now, you're kind of on the right track already with number 2, but if you actually believe number 1, well, you know what? It can happen, but at the same time, if they only won by, let's say, 5 or 6 points, and that one thing made all the difference, well, that means the game was really close in the first place, so you weren't doing as well as you could have. You likely could have done better, because if you were doing better, then that extra 5 points that they won by wouldn't have made a difference. If you had been 8 points ahead of them, they still would have lost. So think about that. Think about, well, what did I do early on that I could have done differently in order to make more points? And in the case where you admit there's that thing that you did bad early on, make sure to realize why it was bad. Whether it was situational that game, how to avoid doing the same thing in the future, how to avoid that kind of thing, how to recover if you do have that kind of thing happen to you. If you lost really badly, maybe think about looking up a video like this one that talks about that particular game and how you can do better at it, some good strategies. Maybe look up online what strategies people might have. Either way, be willing to realize that maybe you didn't play quite as well as you could have, and be willing to learn and get better. Because if your opponent has that willingness to learn, then they're going to keep getting better at the game, and you're just going to keep blaming other things for why you're losing. Or just not play with them in general because they've gotten too good. I don't know. If you enjoy the game and you enjoy playing with your friend, then put in a little effort and learn how to do better. Which brings me up to my last final point of the pep talk. And that is, be ready for a rematch. With bigger 5, 6 player games, whatever, usually people don't immediately want to play again, or you just don't have time. But a lot of the smaller games, the 2-player games, these can often be relatively fast. So the thing is, by the time you finish it might actually be pretty easy to just say, hey, you want to play again now that we know what we're doing? Heck yeah, you do. So be ready for that rematch. If you kind of were setting time aside to play a particular game with someone and they say the game's going to take an hour, maybe set aside 2 or 3 hours for whatever that encounter is going to be. That way you know if they say, do you want to play again, you don't immediately have to leave, You're ready to give that another try. And I guess being willing to give it another try is an important part too. If you happen to lose a game, take it as more of a challenge to do better in the next one. That's why you challenge them to a rematch. Oh, you barely beat me on that one. Let's go again. I think I can do better. Now you notice how none of that was really negative. None of it was detrimental to my opponent. It said, I think I can do better. Let's go again. You're excited about it. You're taking the initiative. So yeah, just think about that. Plus, it'll probably make your opponent feel really good if they, beat you and you still seem excited to play. You aren't just salty that you lost. That'll probably make them feel like they were enjoyable to play with rather than that you didn't want to play that game at all. And that's a good feeling. And I'd like to hope that if you beat your opponent, they'll give you that same good feeling. Maybe they'll challenge you to a rematch, in which case you should accept it. And then you should beat them again because you watched this video and learned some good tips. Anyway, that's been my pep talk. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, or you actually just want to give some people other advice for playing two-player games, or even just want to talk about some of your favorite two-player games, put them all in the comments below. And until next time, live free, game hard.